The egg did not glow. Every other egg in the clutch had done it. One by one, across the jagged black rock of the Dravith nesting grounds, the shells had lit from inside deep orange, furious red, the color of things that burn. The watching crowd had murmured in approval each time. Diplomats from 7 civilizations stood behind reinforced glass and recorded everything. Dravith hatchlings were rare. A full clutch was rarer. Commanders and warlords and crowned heads of alien states had traveled weeks through deep space for this. The last egg sat in the far corner of the rock shelf, slightly smaller than the rest, its surface a flat and unremarkable gray. It did not glow. It had not glowed the day before or the week before that. Elder Vorn, who had overseen 43 clutch hatchings in his long life, had already noted it in his records as a probable null. He had not announced this. There was no point in announcing it. Then the shell cracked. Something pushed out from inside slowly, without the explosive burst the others had shown. A snout appeared, then a head, then a small, clumsy body that immediately stumbled on the wet rock and sat down hard. The hatchling shook its head. It looked around. Its scales were the same flat gray as the shell it had just left. Its eyes were a dull amber. It opened its mouth and tried to breathe fire. Nothing came out. A soft, embarrassed silence moved through the crowd behind the glass. Someone coughed. Elder Vorn walked across the rock shelf, his own scales deep copper and gold in the light of the nesting grounds, and he crouched in front of the hatchling and looked at it for a long moment. He checked its chest for the heat core glow that every Dravith carried. There was nothing, no warmth, no ember. He stood back up. He did not say anything cruel. He simply walked away. That was worse. The other hatchlings were collected by their bonded handlers within the hour. They went into transport cases lined with heat-absorbing material, each one already crackling with the early sparks of what they would become. The gray one sat on the rock shelf and watched them go. It did not make a sound. Standard Dravith protocol for non-viable hatchlings was clean and efficient. A locator beacon was attached to the creature's back leg. The beacon would broadcast a low-frequency distress signal for 30 days. If no one claimed it, the signal would stop. The rock shelf was in unclaimed space, far from any shipping lane. Nobody expected the signal to reach anyone useful. It reached Nora. Her cargo hauler, the Steadfast Complaint, was running a late delivery of filtration parts to a frontier colony 3 systems over when the signal hit her proximity scanner. She almost ignored it. She had a schedule to keep, and the colony had been waiting 2 weeks already. She pulled up the beacon code, ran it against the registry, and found the Dravith notation. She sat with that for a minute. Then she changed course. The rock shelf was exactly as grim as the coordinates suggested. Nora landed on the flat section below the nesting ledge, pulled on her environment coat, and climbed up. The hatchling was still there. It had not moved much. It looked at her with those dull amber eyes and did not run. Nora was not a person who talked to animals as a rule. She crouched down, looked at the creature, and said, "You got left." The hatchling blinked. She looked at the locator beacon on its leg, the empty rock shelf, the cold dark around them. She thought about 30 days of signal broadcasting into nothing. She thought about the filtration parts in her hold and the colony that needed them. She picked the hatchling up. It was heavier than it looked. It did not bite her. She carried it back to the Steadfast Complaint, cleared a space in the secondary storage bay, and set it down on a folded thermal sheet. She gave it water and a portion of the nutrient paste she used for the long hauls. It ate carefully, watching her the whole time. Nora filed an amended course report with the colony, noting a 1-day delay. In the reason field she typed, "Picked up a stray." She did not elaborate. When the Steadfast Complaint touched down at Dustfall Station 9 hours later, the colony came out to meet the shipment. Governor Dale was there himself, because the filtration parts were critical, and he liked to oversee critical deliveries personally. He watched Nora unload the crates. Then he watched her carry something out of the secondary bay, something gray and small, and currently staring at the open sky above the colony with an expression that was difficult to read. Dale looked at Nora. Nora looked at Dale. "It got abandoned," she said. Dale looked at the hatchling again. The hatchling looked at Dale. Its scales were completely without color in the colony's flat morning light. It looked like something made from ash. Dale rubbed the back of his neck. He had a colony to run, a filtration system to repair, and 18 outstanding administrative problems that had been waiting since Tuesday. "Does it bite?" he asked. "Not yet," said Nora. Dale nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he knows he has already made a decision and is just catching up to it. "1 month," he said, "then we figure something out." The hatchling turned back to the sky, still staring upward at something none of them could see. It stayed for 4 years. Dustfall Station smelled like iron dust and engine oil, and Scorch decided early on that this was the correct way for a place to smell. The name had come from Lyra, who was 14 at the time and Nora's apprentice, and had absolutely no hesitation about nomming things. The hatchling had scorched her workbench 3 times in its first week, not with fire, but with strange crackling bursts of static that jumped from its scales and left black marks on anything nearby. Lyra had written Scorch on a piece of tape and stuck it to the storage bay wall, and the name had migrated to the creature itself within 2 days. Nora had not objected. Governor Dale had said nothing. Sergeant Rowe had sighed in a way that meant he had opinions but not the energy. 4 years passed the way years do in frontier colonies, loudly, with heavy equipment and long hours and occasional small disasters. Scorch grew, but not the way Dravith were supposed to grow. It got bigger by about the same amount a large dog gets bigger if you feed it well and it lives a comfortable life. Its scales stayed gray. It never flew more than a few meters off the ground before coming back down. It never breathed fire. It never breathed anything threatening at all. What it did was watch. It watched Nora work. It would sit in the corner of the hangar for hours without moving, tracking her hands as she repaired engines, following the sequence of each step with those amber eyes. When Nora set down a tool and walked away to get something, she would sometimes come back to find Scorch staring at the tool, then at the partially repaired component, then at the tool again, as if it was working something out. It watched Lyra too, though Lyra was harder to watch because Lyra moved constantly and talked constantly and had opinions about everything that she felt required immediate vocal expression. Scorch followed her around the colony like a shadow with scales. When Lyra climbed, Scorch climbed. When Lyra ran diagnostics on the colony's water system, Scorch sat beside her and watched the readouts scroll. Once, when Lyra fell off a supply crate and bruised her knee badly, Scorch pressed its head against her arm and stayed there until she stopped hissing through her teeth. Sergeant Rowe tried twice to run a formal assessment. The first time he set up a standard threat response drill: loud noises, sudden movement, a training drone flying fast and low. The goal was to see whether Scorch would respond with any kind of aggression, display behavior, or self-defense action. Scorch watched the drone with mild interest and then yawned. Rowe filed a report. The report said, "No observable combat capability, no defensive reflex, no offensive output. Recommended relocation to a non-strategic environment." Dale read the report, put it in a drawer, and did not act on it. The second assessment was quieter. Rowe sat in the hangar for 2 hours by himself, just watching Scorch while Scorch watched Nora work. At the end of the 2 hours, Rowe wrote 3 words in his personal notebook and underlined them: waiting for something. He did not file that one officially. It felt too much like a guess. What nobody had fully mapped yet were the discharges. They happened more frequently now than in the early days, and Lyra had started logging them the previous year after noticing they were not random. A discharge when Nora dropped a heavy component and swore. A discharge when the colony alarm ran its weekly test. A long, crackling series of discharges during a particularly bad dust storm that took out 2 outer fences and kept everyone awake for 6 hours. Scorch had stood at the hangar door during that storm and watched it come in from the plains, and the static had crawled across its scales in branching lines the entire time, like lightning looking for a place to land. Lyra's log had 47 recorded events. She had started knotting the emotional conditions around each one. The pattern was not random. The discharges were stronger, more structured, and longer in duration when Scorch was paying close attention to something. Not scared, not aggressive, focused. She had not told anyone yet, because she did not know what she was looking at. One evening she sat in the hangar after Nora had gone in for the night and spread her log across her knees and read through it 3 times. Scorch was lying nearby, awake, watching the hangar's overhead lights flicker in the draft from the ventilation gap. The static moved quietly across its scales in slow, faint arcs, the way it always did when things were calm. Lyra looked at her log. She looked at Scorch. She said quietly, "You're not broken, are you?" Scorch turned its head and looked at her. The amber eyes were steady and unhurried in the way they always were, in the way that had made Ro write what he wrote in his notebook, in the way that Nora had once described to Dale as like talking to someone who already knows the end of the story and is just being polite about it. The static arced between 2 scales near Scorch's shoulder and faded. Lyra closed her log. She decided she would show it to Nora in the morning, not because she had an answer, because she was starting to understand the shape of the question, and questions that size needed a second pair of eyes. Outside, across the dark plains, a sensor buoy at the edge of the Dustfall system was running its normal sweep of the surrounding space. It found something. It flagged the finding and began transmitting. Nobody saw the transmission until morning. The sensor buoy's transmission reached Dustfall's communication tower at 3:40 hours and sat in the incoming queue until the night operator, a young man named Brett who took his job seriously, reviewed it at 400. He read it twice. Then he walked directly to Governor Dale's residential unit and knocked on the door until it opened. Dale read the transmission in his doorway with Brett standing behind him, and the cold pre-dawn air coming off the plains. He said, "Get Ro." By 4:30, the colony's 4 senior staff were in the command room. The transmission was on the main screen. 2 sensor buoys at the outer edge of the Dustfall system had gone dark within 6 hours of each other. Not malfunctioned, dark. The difference mattered. A malfunction sent a final corrupted signal. These had simply stopped, cleanly, as if something had switched them off. Ro stood in front of the screen with his arms crossed and said nothing for a long time. "Military?" Dale asked. "That pattern is a sweep," Ro said. "Something is clearing its approach path." Dale sent a distress call to the nearest Colonial Defense Fleet post before the meeting was over. The response came back in 40 minutes. Estimated deployment time to Dustfall, 36 hours minimum. The fleet was engaged in a border dispute 2 systems over and could not pull forces immediately. They would come, but not fast. The Armada, based on the buoy data and standard Velthari approach speeds, was 8 hours out. Ro did not say that they were going to die. He was not that kind of man. What he did instead was walk to the colony's logistics board and start drawing lines. 412 people, 11 functional transport vessels of varying size. The math did not come out evenly, and everyone in the room knew it. Ro looked at the numbers and began grouping them: medical cases, children under 12, essential technical staff, people with no combat training. He worked steadily and without expression. "I'll need volunteers to stay," he said. He did not look up when he said it. Nobody left the room. Nora spent the next 4 hours in the hangar. The colony had 2 gunships, the Hardline and the Bracket. The Hardline was in reasonable shape. The Bracket was being held together by what Nora privately described as good intentions and outdated epoxy. She worked on the Bracket's main thruster coupling until her hands shook, then switched to the targeting system, then went back to the coupling. Lyra worked beside her, not asking questions, handing tools when Nora reached for them without being told. Scorch sat in the corner. It had been sitting there since Nora arrived. It had not moved to eat, had not gone to find Lyra's company the way it usually did in the mornings. It sat perfectly still in its corner, watching Nora work, and the static moved across its scales in the slow, quiet arcs of a calm day. Except it was not calm. Lyra noticed the static was different. Not in intensity, the arcs were the same size they always were when Scorch was at rest, but they were moving in a pattern she had not seen before. Structured, repeating, like a sequence cycling through itself over and over, patient and precise. She watched it for 10 minutes while Nora worked. Then she pulled out her log. She went through the previous 47 entries. She had been noting emotional conditions, her word for what was happening around Scorch when a discharge event occurred. She had been thinking about it as emotional. Stress response, attention response, reaction to stimulus. She looked at the current pattern on Scorch's scales. She looked at her log. She sat back and felt something very cold move through her chest. The discharges were not emotional responses. They were not random static. She had been measuring the wrong thing. The pattern she was looking at right now, the one cycling slowly and precisely across Scorch's gray scales, was structured in the same way that the largest recorded discharge events had been. The dust storm event. The two incidents when the colony alarm had fired unexpectedly at full volume. The time a mining drill had hit a gas pocket 300 meters out, and the explosion had rattled every window in the station. She had logged all of those as high-stimulus events, high noise, high disruption, but that was not what they had in common. What they had in common was threat. Scorch had known about every one of them, not reacted to them, known about them early and cycled through that same quiet repeating pattern while it waited. Lyra stood up. She said, "Nora." Nora looked over from under the thruster housing. Her face was tired and her hands were dark with grease. "Look at the scales," Lyra said. Nora looked. She watched the pattern for a moment. She climbed out from under the thruster housing and stood up straight. Lyra showed her the log. She walked Nora through the pattern comparison quickly, because there was not time to do it slowly. She pointed to the discharge structure in the earliest high-event entries and pointed to what was currently running across Scorch's body right now. Nora stared at the log for a long time. Then she looked at Scorch. Scorch was already looking at her. Those amber eyes were steady and unhurried, the same way they had always been, and the pattern ran its quiet cycle across the gray scales without pause. "How long has it known?" Nora asked. Lyra checked her first log entry from this morning. The timestamp was 2:20. 80 minutes before Brett knocked on Dale's door. The Armada came out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Dustfall system, like a closed fist opening. 47 vessels. The long-range visual feed showed them in a tight formation, destroyers on the flanks, cruisers in the middle layers, and at the center, the dreadnought that Admiral Koss commanded from a bridge large enough to hold Dustfall's entire command room 4 times over. Someone in the room made a sound when the count hit 30. By 47, nobody was making sounds anymore. The Velthari did not send a communication. They had done this before. Communication meant negotiation, and they had not come to negotiate. The first wave of dropships launched from the destroyer flanks before the Armada even reached close orbit, small, fast, heavy with ground troops, designed to hit the outer perimeter and pull defensive fire, so the cruisers above could map the colony's weapon positions from the return signatures. Rowe had expected this. He had briefed his soldiers on exactly this. He pulled his defensive line back to the second perimeter and let the dropships land into empty ground. The Velthari troops pushed forward and found nothing. They pushed further and found Rowe's actual line, which was dug in, covered, and shooting from 3 angles at once. The orbital cannon fired twice, both hits, one cruiser damaged, one veering wide before a precise strike from above collapsed the cannon's mounting platform in a single blow. Rowe had expected that too. He had given the cannon operators a two-shot window in his briefing and told them to take it and get out. The hardline launched from the colony airstrip with Rose second in command at the controls. It drew 3 Velthari fighters immediately, which was what Ro needed. The fighters pulled away from the evacuation corridor for 90 seconds, and 6 transport vessels got into the upper atmosphere in that window. Then the bracket launched. Nora flew it herself because she was the only person who understood its specific and numerous mechanical personalities well enough to keep it airborne under fire. It handled like a cart with opinions. She pushed it into the cruiser formation at a low angle, drew fire from 2 ships, and bought the next wave of evacuations another 2 minutes. On the ground, Ro held the second perimeter. His soldiers knew every meter of it. The Velthari had numbers and better weapons. The humans had the ground and the willingness to use all of it. The fight was ugly and close and did not go well, but it went longer than any Velthari tactical model had projected for a colony of this size, and that time was being spent on the evacuation airstrip. At the landing pad, Lyra was helping load the last medical cases onto the final transport. She turned back to move another carry case and nearly walked into Scorch. The hatchling was standing at the edge of the pad, facing the sky. It was not looking at Lyra. It was not looking at anything on the ground. Its head was tilted upward, toward the armada hanging in the upper atmosphere like a bruise across the sky, and the static on its scales was no longer the slow, quiet cycling pattern she had watched all morning. It was running fast, faster than she had ever seen it. The arcs were not soft and branching, they were tight, defined, snapping from scale to scale in deliberate lines that covered its entire body from the tip of its tail to the flat ridge above its eyes. Its scales, which had been gray for its entire life, were shifting. The color was draining out of gray and pulling toward something darker, charged, the color of clouds before a lightning strike. Its eyes were no longer amber, they were white. Lyra set the carry case down. She walked to Scorch. The air around the creature tasted like metal and smelled like rain on hot stone. She crouched beside it, and the static jumped from its scales to her arm in one brief, painless arc that left the hairs standing. She did not ask it to do anything. She did not know if it could understand her. She did not know what it was about to do or if it could do anything at all. She put her hand on the side of its neck and said, "I know you're in there." Scorch turned its head and looked at her. The white eyes held for a moment. Then it made a sound she had never heard from it before, low, short, something between a click and a hum, and looked back at the sky. It spread its wings. They were still small. They had always been small. They were not built for soaring or for covering distance. They were not that kind of wings. Scorch launched. What came next did not look like a weapon firing. It looked like a signal transmitting a burst from the creature's body that expanded outward in a fast, invisible ring, propagating through the upper atmosphere and into the space beyond. To the people watching from the ground, what they saw was a pulse of white light that lasted less than 2 seconds and left no fire, no explosion, no visible damage of any kind. In the Velthari armada above, every system went dark at once. Navigation, offline. Weapons targeting, offline. Communication arrays, offline. Engine control, offline. 47 vessels running on a unified networked command architecture because it was efficient and fast and had never needed a fallback, lost every networked function simultaneously. The ships did not explode. They did not burn. They simply stopped, drifting on momentum, silent and blind above Dustfall Station like 47 enormous stones thrown by a hand that had forgotten to let go. Scorch dropped from the sky like it had been switched off. Lyra caught its head before it hit the landing pad. Above them, the armada drifted in perfect silence. The shooting had stopped. On the ground perimeter, Ro looked up. He did not understand what had happened. What he understood was the silence, and that the silence was good. For 6 hours after the pulse, the armada drifted. The colonial defense fleet, already rerouted the moment their distress call had been upgraded to active combat priority, arrived to find 47 Velthari vessels in low orbit, completely powerless, their crews alive and extremely confused. The Marines who boarded the dreadnought found Admiral Koss seated at his dead command console, running manual calculations on a paper backup sheet, something nobody on that bridge had ever used before trying to estimate how long his life support reserves would last without main power. He did not resist boarding. He was a practical man, and practical men do not fight a situation that has already finished. What he asked, once he was aboard the colonial frigate and had been given water and a chair, was very specific. He asked the debriefing officer to explain to him how a gray, undersized, reportedly non-functional Dravith hatchling had produced an electromagnetic disruption precise enough to target unified command architecture without damaging independent mechanical systems. His life support had run fine. His doors had opened manually. But every networked system in every ship in his fleet had been hit at exactly the same layer, as if something had known the exact frequency to use. The debriefing officer did not know how to answer that. Nobody did yet, but they were going to find out, which was the problem, because everyone wanted to find out at the same time. The story was out within 24 hours. Someone on the Colonial Defense Fleet had talked, which was inevitable, and then someone in the Dustfall colony had talked, which was more inevitable, and by the following morning there were 17 media vessels requesting landing clearance that the colony's battered traffic control tower was not equipped to handle. Dale handled them the way he handled every administrative problem methodically, and with the expression of a man who had accepted that his week was ruined. Scorch slept for 36 hours. It slept in the hangar, on the thermal sheet that had been its bed since the beginning, and it did not move except to breathe. The scales were gray again. The eyes, when they opened briefly, were amber again. It ate a small amount when Lyra put food near it, then went back to sleep. Roe checked on it twice, said nothing either time, and left a bowl of water near the thermal sheet each visit. Elder Vorn arrived on the second day. He came in a Dravith diplomatic vessel, copper and gold trimmed, considerably more impressive than anything Dustfall's landing pad had ever hosted. He did not bring apology. He brought legal language, which was worse. He informed Governor Dale, through his representative, that the creature designated as a Dravith null hatchling at the 43rd clutch ceremony had been misclassified due to an observational oversight, and that the Dravith Collective wished to bring the creature back to the nesting grounds for full evaluation and proper integration. He used the word integration carefully, the way people use words when they mean something else. Dale listened to the full presentation without interrupting. He had his own legal representative in the room, a sharp, quiet woman named Ada who had been the colony's charter administrator for 11 years and had forgotten more about colonial law than most people learned. When the presentation was finished, Dale spoke. He said that Scorch had resided at Dustfall Station for 4 years under colonial charter residency, that the Dravith Collective had formally and publicly relinquished all claim to the creature at the 43rd clutch ceremony via the standard null hatchling protocol, and that colonial charter law did not recognize retroactive claim restoration on the basis of reclassification. He said this politely and without raising his voice. Elder Vorn was not accustomed to being told no by a colony governor on a world he had not previously been able to locate on a standard star map. The conversation that followed was long, and recorded from 7 angles by the media vessels that had found creative ways to point equipment at the command building, and would later be studied in political and legal programs across 3 systems, as a textbook example of what happened when an ancient civilization's assumptions ran into a well-administered frontier charter. Elder Vorn left without Scorch. His expression in the recording was one of a man recalculating something he had been certain of for a very long time. Nora gave one press statement. She had been asked for interviews, commentary, background briefings, and personal reflections by 41 separate media outlets in 48 hours. She declined all of them and sent a single written statement instead. It was 4 sentences. The last one read, "We did not raise a weapon. We raised a neighbor." The statement was broadcast more widely than the battle footage. Rowe filed an updated assessment in the colony defense records. He had filed one 4 years ago recommending relocation. He pulled that one, marked it void, and replaced it with a new entry. The new entry contained the creature's name, its residency status, its role in the defense of Dustfall Station, and a single line in the capability field that read, "Asset nature and parameters still being determined." He signed it and closed the file. 3 days after the battle, when the last of the media vessels had been redirected to a designated press area 2 kilometers from the colony, and the colonial defense fleet had established a patrol arc in the upper atmosphere, and the Velthari prisoners had been transferred to a secure transport, Dale walked to the hangar. Scorch was awake. It was sitting in its corner. It watched Dale cross the hangar floor with those steady amber eyes. Dale crouched down in front of it. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "Good job." Scorch blinked once slowly. Dale stood up and went back to work. He had 18 outstanding administrative problems, and they had now become 44. Dustfall rebuilt the way frontier colonies always rebuild, without ceremony, without waiting for permission, and with a great deal of noise. The outer fence came back up in 3 days. The collapsed orbital cannon platform was cleared in 4. The hangar's eastern wall, which had taken a grazing hit during the dropship assault, was patched by the end of the first week with materials that did not perfectly match the original but held better, Nora noted, because she had installed them herself, and she did not do things halfway. The bracket sat in the hangar with its thruster coupling finally, properly repaired. Nora had fixed it right this time, without the pressure of an incoming armada. It would never be a good ship. It would be a reliable one, which was more valuable. Scorch grew 3 inches over the following month. The scales stayed gray. Nobody in Dustfall thought gray was the wrong color anymore. A researcher arrived 6 weeks after the battle, a young Dravith named Sova, who came alone and without official Dravith collective credentials, which she explained immediately, and with obvious discomfort was because she had not been sent. She had read the battle reports and the technical analyses that the Colonial Defense Science team had begun circulating, and she had come on her own because she needed to see Scorch in person. She explained to Nora and Lyra in the hangar, with Scorch sitting in its corner watching her the way it watched everything, that electromagnetic pulse Dravith were theoretical. The academic literature described them as a hypothetical developmental variant, noted once in a historical text 400 years old, and then never observed. The Dravith had assumed that the variant was non-viable, because every hatchling that showed no fire core glow was classified as null and processed accordingly. She said the phrase, "processed accordingly," and then stopped and looked at Scorch and did not continue that sentence. What they had been measuring, she said carefully, was fire output, because fire was what Dravith did. Fire was their weapon, their signal, their identity. A hatchling without fire was, by every metric they used, empty. She looked at Lyra's discharge log for a long time. She looked at the pattern data from the battle. She said, with the specific kind of embarrassment that comes from representing an entire civilization's mistake, "We were looking for the wrong thing." Lyra did not say anything gracious. She said, "Yes." And then she showed Sova the full 4 years of data, and they spent the next 3 days going through it together, because Lyra had no interest in being gracious but considerable interest in someone finally being able to explain what she had been looking at. The Colonial Senate sent a delegation. They wanted Dustfall classified as a protected strategic system, which Dale accepted. They wanted a permanent defense installation established in the outer system, which Dale also accepted. Then they presented a proposal to integrate Scorch as a designated colonial defense asset, with protocols and a command structure, and a formal role in the fleet's rapid response planning. Dale read the proposal. He set it down. He said that Scorch was not a weapon in their arsenal. Scorch was a person who lived in Dustfall Station under colonial charter residency. If Scorch chose to act in defense of the colony or the people in it, that had always been Scorch's choice and would remain Scorch's choice. The colonial Senate did not get to add Scorch to a manifest. The delegation was not happy. Dale had stopped caring about making delegations happy somewhere around day 4 of the aftermath, when he had stopped sleeping more than 4 hours at a time. Rowe trained the new defense recruits who had transferred to Dustfall. 41 people, young and capable and carrying the particular energy of soldiers who had heard the story and wanted to be part of whatever came next. Rowe did not let them near the defense planning for the first 2 weeks. He made them walk the colony. Every corridor, every workshop, every water junction and storage block and residential unit. He made them eat in the mess hall with the colonists and sit in on the maintenance briefings and learn the names of the people who ran the water recycling system. One of them asked when they were going to start combat training. Rowe said, "When you know what you're fighting for." Months settled over Dustfall, the way months do, when they are not carrying armadas inside them. On an evening when the dust was low and the sky above the plains was the particular deep blue it turned in the late hours before dark, Nora sat on a flat rock at the colony's outer ridge and looked at the plains. It was quiet. Somewhere above the atmosphere, a colonial defense frigate ran its patrol arc, and the knowledge of it sat in the back of her mind the way background sounds did noted, and then not noticed. Scorch sat beside her. It was bigger than it had been, still not large by anyone else's standard. Its scales were gray in the fading light, and in the quiet, the faintest arcs of static moved across them the way they always did when there was nothing to be alert about. Slow and even like breathing. Nora had a faulty calibrator in her hands that had been misbehaving for 3 days. She turned it over, found the component housing, and started examining it by touch and fading light the way she examined everything methodically, and without needing it to be easy. She felt Scorch shift beside her. Then one claw touched the calibrator casing lightly, a small, precise discharge, clean, targeted. The fault cleared. Nora looked at the calibrator. She looked at Scorch. She said, "Show off." The arc danced between Scorch's horns, brief, bright and gone. It was by now a laugh. Everyone in Dustfall knew that.